Thank you everyone for joining us today to learn what we can about the recent Kaseya VSA mass ransomware attack. Before we start, I wanted to introduce us, me and Marc. I'll start with myself. I'm Corey Nachreiner. I'm now the Chief Security Officer for WatchGuard Technologies, was the CTO. Among other things, that means I kind of manage and run, along with Marc, our WatchGuard Threat Lab, a group of researchers that kind of keep our thumb on the pulse of the underground, follow the latest attacks, go to all the conferences to make sure that we know what's happening on the underground and in the security community so that we can help keep our customers safe. Longtime security nerd, and also kind of a pretty cliche nerd in general too. But with that, I'll hand it over to Marc to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, thank you. So like Corey said, I'm Marc. I'm our security operations manager at WatchGuard, where of all the many hats that I wear as well, some of the things we do is our team helps run security operations at the company. And then I also help manage our threat research team, like Corey mentioned there. As with most folks in the tech industry, I suppose I'm a pretty big nerd too. I've got a long history of traditional hacking, with IoT being one of my big passion projects as well. And like Corey said, our team's well positioned to basically keep an eye on what the threat landscape looks like. Big attacks and events like this one, as they happen, we try and get information out as quickly as possible through our blog and our security reports and our weekly podcast as well, to help keep you guys defended against these ongoing threats. So with that, without any further ado, let's go ahead and hop right in.
Yeah, we have a lot to cover, and we'd like to leave some time at the end for questions in case you have them. And just to start, it's obviously an unfortunate incident, especially for any MSPs and partners. WatchGuard's very much a channel company, so we work a lot with MSPs and partners. But as you know, on July 2nd, there was an incident that affected Kaseya VSA products and resulted in ransomware affecting a lot of MSPs and their customers as well. But today, to talk about this, we're going to start by really giving you, at the beginning, a high-level overview of what happened. At this point, you probably know, but we'll cover all the bases just to make sure. And by the way, the blog Marc was talking about is secplicity.org. We had our post up there on July 2nd as well, so you could see some of that detail being updated quite regularly there. Then we're going to dive into the technical details we know about the attack so far. And there are still actually a few mysteries because this does involve what I consider a 0-day. By the way, I know some vendors are saying because a particular organization disclosed these flaws back in April, they're not really 0-day. But to me, if it's not patched, and by the way, there are unpatched flaws, it is still 0-day. So we'll talk about some of those technical attack details. We will talk about some of WatchGuard's protections because many of you are probably WatchGuard customers and want to know what our products do. I want to be very careful to say this isn't a sales pitch though, by the way. We are really here to just educate our MSPs, who are really an important customer to us. We're not trying to sell you on these products. We just want you to know what they can and cannot do to keep you safe. And then after that, we'll go into both some incident-specific defense tips, things you can do now and going forward to protect your actual Kaseya servers, but also some general ransomware defense tips, because as many of you know, this isn't the first time MSPs have been targeted with ransomware. Back in 2019, there were very similar cases of this too. And finally, we hope to get through this quickly so we can leave time for questions. We'll mostly answer them at the end, but if we see some that are relevant to slides during, we'll try to get them there. Before I move forward, though, we have a very quick polling question, if Alicia can help me out, and it's mostly to see how many of you actually use the Kaseya product. So Alicia, let me know if you can get that polling question up. Not sure if anyone is seeing anything in the background. Yep. Oh, good, there we go. So essentially the question is, do you use Kaseya VSA's RMM? And if you do, are you using the SaaS version? We'll talk more about this in detail in a moment, but the SaaS version does not seem to be affected by some of the issues we'll talk about, even though it is down as right now as well, or the on-prem version. So I'll give you a few moments to submit your answers. Oop. And I think maybe that's enough time. I'm not sure if you're able to display the results now.
You should read the results, Corey. Do you want me to read it for you, or you can see that?
It'd be great if you could read them. I actually don't see them on my screen right now. It could be because of the presentation.
Okay. 7% says yes, the SaaS version. 8% says yes, the on-premise version. 40% no, I use another brand RMM. And 46% no, I don't use an RMM.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. So it sounds like about 15% of folks do use Kaseya, and about 8% the one that's directly affected. Again, the SaaS one, according to Kaseya, there's no evidence that that one was affected, but it's good to know. By the way, for people that use other RMMs, this will not be bashing Kaseya, because these sorts of issues can happen with any software product. So just important to know, which one you use, and always keep up to date with patches when they're available. But we'll talk more about that going forward. But without further ado, let's really quickly cover what we do know about this attack at a high level, then dive into the tech details. I'll start by saying, as mentioned, it's occurred during the morning of July 2nd. It may have occurred as early as like 9 a.m. Eastern time. This is when they started overtaking the Kaseya servers using vulnerabilities. Do know, we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the actual time the ransomware dropped was synchronized, or seems to be synchronized, not just among individual victims, but between all of them to a specific time we'll mention. From what we've seen from the community on Reddit, and because of great research from folks like Huntress Labs, about 30 MSPs are reportedly affected by this. And when it affects them, it affects their customers too, because this ransomware goes out to all the agents that the MSP has, client agents installed on, which is typically all their customers for remote management. It sounds like this is still developing a little, but that means around 1,500 to 2,000 other organizations could have been affected by this ransomware through these MSPs. And it's very strongly, it seems to very much come from the Revil gang, a well-known Sodinokibi ransomware gang, which we'll talk about in a second. And finally, Marc will show you a screenshot, but these attackers right now are asking for 70 million in ransom. And why don't you keep going, Marc?
Yeah, and so it looks like all signs point to they exploited multiple zero-day vulnerabilities in on-premises Kaseya VSA servers. Now, Kaseya hasn't released a lot of details, but researchers have been able to reproduce the exploit chain, which it seems to include an authentication bypass, an arbitrary file upload, and a command injection vulnerability, all used in a sequence in order to deploy this ransomware and execute it. We do know that researchers at the Dutch Institute of Vulnerability Disclosure noted that they had reported multiple vulnerabilities to Kaseya back in April, but many were still awaiting resolution. We'll get to it a little bit later on a different slide, but yesterday they actually published a limited disclosure pointing to 7 different flaws, 4 of which were resolved actually in early May, but 3 are still awaiting resolution, including one of which they believe was that authentication bypass. So we'll get to that a little bit later. We know that the malware starts with living off the land techniques. It leverages PowerShell and CertUtil throughout it, tools that are built into Windows to help disable protections and decode the actual stagers and malware as they execute them on the system. We have not actually seen any signs of data exfiltration for double extortion yet. Revil campaigns are typically very public when they have stolen information. We'll show you in just a little bit a screenshot of their happy blog, as they call it, where they tend to post whether they have data stolen or not, and they're demanding extra extortions out of that. We have not seen that in this case. It looks to be just a traditional single extortion ransomware attack, which I guess small victories there. And then the incident does appear to be isolated to on-premises Kaseya customers, but the root cause does appear to have existed, at least in the cloud offering too, as is evident just by them turning off their entire cloud infrastructure while working on a patch for that too. That said, there doesn't appear to be any evidence of cloud-based customers having been hit by this. They were pretty quick to call their customers though and tell them to turn off their on-premises servers though to help protect against falling victim to this attack as it was unfolding during the day. So I mentioned that Kaseya, or not Kaseya, Revil tends to maintain basically a kill list of all of their victims on this blog available on the dark web. We have redacted the URL, but it's pretty widely available with just a bit of Google searching out there. I will say that, as with most things on the dark web, just be careful as you poke around. But on this blog, they maintain 25 pages of organizations that they have breached over time. If you do visit it, you notice there have been at least a half dozen after this Kaseya incident as well. And they do tend to post when they have stolen data. They'll give examples of it and then demand that double extortion then of threatening to release the data if they aren't paid in a timely manner. Again, we haven't seen that with the Kaseya attack. We just see their ransomware note demanding $70 million for a master decryption key in order to regain access to all these systems. I've seen some researchers point to this basically being the only way to potentially regain access because some of the command and control infrastructure has been taken down. And so organizations that don't have backups in place may be having a bit of an issue getting back to that at this point.
By the way, Marc and I always fight with each other about pronunciation of things on our 443 podcast. Be sure to check out the 443 podcast if you want information about this and other things. But I think it's pronounced are evil, and I say that because it's accurate branding. They surely are evil. Ha ha ha, dad joke.
God.
Sorry about that. So to give you a really quick timeline, as mentioned, this happened, really around 6, 7 a.m. on July 2nd. That, by the way, is also, I'll talk about this later, when WatchGuard's telemetry started to see the first indicators of compromise in clients that our EDR solution, our Adaptive Defense 360 solution, and our EPP solution started seeing a particular part of this attack we'll talk about. Now, do know the attack we're seeing is mostly the malware dropping payload. The attack that happened to the Kaseya server could happen before this because it then uses different commands to send out, you'll see the command string in a while to send out the actual commands to all the clients that the VSA system protects. So shortly after that, if you follow our MSP, I know a lot of people think Reddit is just for fun and games, but I actually think the R sysadmin and the R MSP are fantastic subs to follow. That is where the MSP community often gathers, and Huntress Labs often notes things there. And in midday on the RMSP Reddit, they started a master post there, as did other people on sysadmin, and that's where a lot of information came in. If you're not following that as an MSP, highly recommend you do, because you might get early warning. And then throughout the day, Kaseya, by midday, maybe 1 p.m. Pacific, Kaseya had their advisory released. And as Marc said, they took the hard action of turning off your on-premise, Kaseya VSA server, which obviously kind of impacts your remote management. It gives you an idea of how serious this was. Shortly after that, by the way, we had a Secplicity post. Now on Saturday, we learned that they're basically called the Danish Institute of Vulnerability Disclosure, or DIVD. They disclosed that they had found a lot of Kaseya vulnerabilities back in April that they had disclosed. And they also said, by the way, Kaseya had worked diligently with them. They hadn't fixed every vulnerability yet, and as we'll learn, at least one of the unfixed ones was used in this. And there could be one additional one too, by the way. But they had released details, or they had at least informed Kaseya about this flaw. And since then, we've been getting a lot of updates. Kaseya themselves have maintained a blog post, which I recommend you check every day because it has updates. At one point, they had promised to restore the SaaS service by the 6th, which was a few days ago, but technical issues prevented that from happening. They also said they would restore or send a patch for the on-premise server within 24 hours of that cloud restore. But, plans don't always fall into place. So right now, there is no patch, and the SaaS service hasn't been restored. And right now, I believe you'll see the patch actually coming before the VSA server is restored. In their latest update, the CEO has a video where he apologizes and talks about this. And he mentions if you're a SaaS user, the SaaS version should come up sometime Sunday. He said around Sunday afternoon. So you can probably expect that. They say they're much more confident of that time than of the past ones they've shared. And we do expect the patch could come today or even tomorrow. So that is the timeline so far. I did want to mention, since we talked about it, we have seen this attack with our endpoint security software. WatchGuard has a number of endpoint products. We acquired a company called Panda Security, which has a fantastic product called Adaptive Defense 360. It includes EPP and EDR. What you're going to see in these screenshots are actually from some of the cloud management that customers can use to see these products too. And what you're seeing here, there is a command that's part of the ransomware dropper that we'll talk about in detail, but this is the first time we saw it on clients. And by the way, as you also see, we blocked this action using AD360. Besides AD360, do you know we also released the WatchGuard version of that, which is called WatchGuard EPDR. So it also has this protection. And even the consumer version of Panda Dome has the protections we call contextual engine. That is a kind of engine with a number of rules that can catch some of these living off the land techniques and other malicious actions we see malware doing. So you are protected from at least the dropping of the ransomware using these products, as we'll talk about more. But with that, why don't we go into the technical analysis, Marc?
Yeah, so even in the short period of time since the attack, we know quite a lot, thanks to our own telemetry and some third-party research as well. As for the malware itself, like what the attackers did after gaining access to the Kaseya environment and dropping it onto hosts, we know very well exactly what was going on, thanks to catching, like Corey said, many of the incidents on WatchGuard customer endpoints. The root cause, though, how the attackers deployed the malware, for example, is something that's still coming to light. We know quite a bit. We're able to guess quite a bit, make educated guesses based off other behaviors that we and other researchers have seen. But Kaseya hasn't confirmed any of the details yet. So most of the industry is still pretty heads down trying to piece it all together themselves until we get that confirmation from Kaseya. And so let's go ahead and start, though, with the root cause of exactly how this attack may have occurred or likely occurred. And we know the attackers exploited multiple zero-day vulnerabilities in Kaseya VSA to deploy this ransomware on customer networks. Now, details on the vulnerabilities are still not completely known, but based off of DIVD's disclosure and some work by Huntress, we've kind of narrowed it down to, again, those three main: authentication bypass, a command injection, and a arbitrary file upload flaw. There are potentially others that were involved, but Huntress was actually able to recreate the entire exploit chain based off of other telemetry and information they had access to. We know that they... Go ahead.
I was just going to say, yes, Huntress, Huntress between the get and pull requests or post requests that many MSPs shared to help research this attack, they pretty quickly figured out the command injection vulnerability and the arbitrary file upload. The authentication bypass is the one we just this morning learned is an unpatched one that comes from DIVD or probably. The CVE you see above is actually a credential leak we'll talk about in a second. Now, so the point is, these are zero-day issues. Even a fully patched VSA on-premise server would be vulnerable to these, and it's a non-user interaction attack, so this would just happen. What they did next on the VSA server is still being figured out, but essentially they did drop files. First was an agent.crt file, and the other one was screenshot.jpg. Neither of them, it's not a JPEG at all. Both of these files actually include code to be executed. And a lot of this code has to do with creating something that was called the VSA agent hotfix update procedure that would then send some information for all your agents, your clients out there to execute locally. So as Marc mentioned, just today we learned that DIVD gave a limited disclosure. Now, just so you know, it's good that they're not disclosing stuff. Even though all of us in the community really are curious technical nerds, they shouldn't be disclosing technical details right now. While a threat actor obviously knows some of the technical details, sharing those details right now could make this attack worse. So just know the reason they're waiting to release all the details is good. It's to protect people. It's to wait for the patch to be out and give some time for that patch to be applied. But what they shared today, Marc mentioned the 7 vulnerabilities. These are them. The one on top is the CV referenced in the slide before, and that is probably what's getting them past the authentication part of that. It's a credential leak due to a business logic flaw. A lot of these are patched, but 3 of them aren't. The credential leak, obviously, but also there's a cross-site scripting vulnerability and apparently a 2-factor bypass that DIVD knows about that Kaseya is still fixing. So details for these will come out. Not all of them have been fixed, and that's why they're being held. So with that, as I mentioned, the way this attack starts is really they hijack your Kaseya server. Those chain of vulnerabilities give them essentially full control of that server, and then they create procedures using that tool to send out what will show up in your log as a Kaseya VSA agent hotfix. But what's really happening is this long command you see here is being run on the endpoints. Let's go through it really quick. So this command is actually a multi-part, it's using command.exe, which is obviously Windows command line. It's doing a multi-part command with CMD, but then executing some PowerShell that is also multiple part as well. So it starts, by the way, by just doing this kind of delay tactic. It does this ping where the number you actually see, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but the number you see here is going to be very different for every victim based on a variable they've taken in other code. And this is really where they're actually delaying the dropping, delaying the rest of this command until 1630 UTC time. And this is where they're kind of synchronizing so that the ransomware is dropped at really around the same time for all the victims. So really everyone gets encrypted around the same time, even other victims. So that is kind of the delaying tactic, and it can be an evasive tactic too, because some behavioral things look for malware to do stuff right away. So if it's waiting, you kind of have to either wait along with it or trick it into doing more. The next thing it does is run a big long PowerShell command. Now, I haven't listed the whole command in that number 2 bullet. You can see it above, but that PowerShell command is also doing a lot of evasion and trying to bypass security control. It's disabling real-time monitoring, IPS, cloud lookup, script scanning, all kinds of network protection. It's trying to disable a lot of security that does exist on some of these endpoints in some cases. Next, we see it actually copy a legitimate cert utility to another Windows directory location. Now, cert util is a very legitimate Windows process. It's used for certificate services, but it's actually capable of doing a lot of things like URL parsing and even moving files. So it's one of the tools that bad guys use in living off the land attacks. If they can get system privilege on a computer, they don't need to drop malware right away. They can use existing tools to do a lot of bad stuff. And the reason they use the existing tools like PowerShell, like cert util, is because these are legitimate processes that Windows trusts. So if you're not paying attention to what these processes do, you might miss a lot of the bad stuff they're doing. So using cert util is a very common living off the land technique. And as you can see, going to the Windows directory, what they're doing is moving a cert.exe to that directory because they want to, some of those directories, it's assumed it's a bad program unless a legitimate program put it there. And by the way, of course, then they use this evasive technique to bypass kind of detections that will identify system binaries outside their standard installation paths. But Marc, I believe you had a story to add here based on another attack we saw.
If you follow our blog on secplicity.org, it was a few months ago now, we actually saw a similar technique used by a threat actor who was deploying a crypto miner through a Microsoft SQL server. Where they copied PowerShell out of its normal directory into a different location as another potentially evasive technique for tools that look for specific applications being run like PowerShell. Like this seems to be a pretty common trend these days of using legitimate tools in different locations, in this case, appending random data to it to change up the hash of it so it doesn't look like cert util running somewhere else. And it works. They do it because it works. Like a lot of endpoint protection, this kind of tricks them into letting it run in that case.
Yep. And then, of course, they actually used this fake copy of cert-util to one of its things is being able to decode things, and that's where they take agent.crt and turn it into the real executable, the piece, the ransomware encryptor, which we'll explain that has multiple parts as well in a moment. By the way, that agent working directory, that is going to be wherever your default Kaseya working directory is. I think it's sometimes called K-working, but depending on how you install it, could be many different directory names, and they use a variable there, so it will always match whatever your actual Kaseya VSA working directory is. So at this point, of course, it's leveraging everything it did to actually decode that CRT file into the real executable. And then finally, you know, it deletes all of its actions from before to clean up after itself, and it executes agent.exe. I'll let Marc talk about that in a moment, but just so you know, all of this was detected and blocked using different or contextual engine rules. This is actual visualization you can see in some of our 8360 and other endpoint management tools. You can actually see the command that was being run here, and you can actually see the process of everything command.exe executed and did. And we can't, command.exe is goodware, so we don't block that. But some of the rules and things we do with our endpoint security is monitor what it does, and we can detect different malicious actions, and that's essentially what we did. We'll talk more about that in screenshots in a second, but Marc, why don't you talk a little bit more about agent.exe?
Yeah, so agent.exe is the decoded output of basically that agent.crt file was just a base64 encoded executable in this case. And so cert-util is decoding it back into a binary that the attackers had dropped on the system and then executed. And this is responsible for generating both the library for encryption that Revil, Revil, whatever we decide to pronunciate it as.
They are evil.
Yes, whatever. It drops that, and then it drops another executable, mspeng.exe, which is actually an old but legitimate copy of Microsoft Defender onto the system. So the DLL is the Revil ransomware encryptor. It's where all of the actual malicious code is. And then the other executable is just, again, a valid application. And it uses DLL hijacking in this case to load up the ransomware library into that executable. Now, DLL hijacking, it's not actually as sophisticated as it sounds. Like executables on Windows and other operating systems load a bunch of different private and shared libraries from different locations on the system when they start up and as they're running. And if that application, that executable, doesn't check whether those libraries are signed and have a valid signature, it means that an attacker can overwrite that library with another DLL. And when that executable goes and runs, it'll then pull that overwritten library into it and execute it as if it were the legitimate one. This is actually a pretty clever evasion technique because some anti-malware engines might see the valid Microsoft Defender process starting up, and they might skip additional checks then because, as it tends to be, you don't want to mess with other anti-malware engines that are running. And so if they skipped additional checks, then they might miss the fact that it's loading now a tainted library into its process. And then again, once it starts up, one of the calls to that tainted library starts the actual ransomware execution. You can see we have also included one of the common ransom notes that you get after a Revil or Sodinokibi ransomware attack. Fresh with all the, the bad grammar and, oh, what happened? And, oh, you're about to have a pretty bad day. Here's how to download Tor, go to our website and pay us Bitcoin or Monero, or you're not going to get access to your files back ever again, basically. Pretty run-of-the-mill ransomware at that point.
By the way, for those that are curious, you may not need this because a lot of your security software, for instance, if you use ours, has all of this. But here's some of the indicators of compromise around this, hashes for the files we've seen. Also, the folks that have been following this follow the original IP that actually attacked the Kaseya servers. They seem to be using valid hosted cloud environments that many customers can use to help themselves. We will try to get a PDF version of these slides out if you want these. Do know a lot of your security software has this. It's a side note. It has nothing to do with anything. It's more probably commentary from these Russian actors. But Revil is known for dropping this particular kind of hot topic in the US registry key for no apparent reason. This does seem, Revil is a Russian ransomware actor, has nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. So with that, let's go ahead and pop into WatchGuard product protections. Again, I don't really want to, this isn't to sell anything, but we just want our customers out there, if you do use Kaseya and you use our product, we want you to know what we offer to catch this type of attack in general. So first, why don't you cover the network ones, Marc?
Yeah, so as with most major incidents like this, like our team went and checked our protections as quickly as possible because we want to be able to put out a blog post and let our own customers know exactly like how they're protected and if they're not, or if they are, what they need to do to ensure they are. So we went out and quickly got a hold of any of the executables, the binary, the malware, the droppers, whatever we get our hands on, and run them through our different tools to try and figure out where they stack up. So WatchGuard customers might be familiar with just the different anti-malware engines that run on the Firebox. For those protections, a sandboxing one was able to detect and block the agent executable immediately. We got a copy of that payload very early on, and we were able to confirm. You can see in the screenshot here from our own infrastructure of the different detection methods that it threw and the different flags it threw as it was inspecting that payload.
And I just want to make clear, this is because of behavioral detection. Unlike something like GAV, which now has signatures, Marc will talk about in a second, this can catch, we were talking a lot about zero-day exploits in this presentation. We also describe something called zero-day malware. It's when something like Sodi no Kipi is being repacked over and over to evade signature-based malware. A lot of new ransomware is not caught by signatures the first day, let alone the first week. The cool thing about APT blocker is this was immediate protection. It's the behaviors that triggered that allowed us to catch this immediately. And from that point on, everyone was immediately protected without any wait for a signature. Sorry, Marc, I just wanted to make that clear.
That is one of the benefits of behavioral detection, because at the end of the day, malware is malicious software. It's doing something bad. And so if you sit there and watch its behaviors, you're going to detect that, raise enough flags, and you're able to block it. But even the signature-based gateway antivirus does now have signatures to detect the associated files, signatures and different heuristics to block it. That said, so intrusion prevention system does not currently have signatures for these zero-day exploits, mostly because they are still technically zero-day. We don't know details about the vulnerabilities, and until we know until we know the details, we can't get signatures for them. But as soon as we know the details, we'll have signatures available within IPS to protect unpatched servers there. Hopefully, everyone that is a VSA admin will have patched their servers, but this will at least pick up some of the slack for those that don't. One thing to note, though, so all of these anti-malware protections only happen if the file is transmitted over a network through a proxy. This is why inspecting network traffic through a proxy, doing HTTPS decryption wherever you can is so important, because if you can't see into that, you're basically missing an entire layer of protection and then relying just on endpoint protection to pick up the slack, which luckily in this scenario did a pretty decent job of picking up that slack. But just in the grand scheme of cybersecurity, you never want to layer yourself, or you never want to let yourself rely on just a single layer of protection. Yeah. So Corey, you want to?
I'll go into endpoint, but to put this last one another way is our network malware protection depends on two things. One is the way you configure it, and two is kind of the technical details about how the attack, especially if it's a vulnerability, transfers the files, because there's a lot of different ways to transfer the files. But for the first, for example, for us to have caught this, that means you have to have, you likely, if you have a Kaseya server behind a firewall, you have a policy allowing traffic to its web interface, I'm sure. And hopefully that is a proxy service. And that also means you have to use the proxy server, the HTTP server policy in that proxy. Now, assuming all of that's done, you can definitely catch any files that are transmitted via HTTP or HTTPS if you're using our deep, our application layer gateway for SSL TLS, you will be able to catch it. So that's one thing. We have really great network protection, but you have to actually be using the policies properly in order for it to work. So note that. And then the second thing is it all depends, because there's different ways to transfer files once you're leveraging a vulnerability. Some people TFTP back out. So it does depend a little bit on exactly how these attackers are exploiting the vulnerability. But as Marc said, if you have our endpoint protection, that's even better, because you're catching, in this case, you're not really protecting against the attack against the VSA server itself, but we can catch and stop this ransomware. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a number of different endpoint products. The original Panda Adaptive Defense 360, our new WatchGuard EPDR, Cytomic, which is kind of a more advanced Panda product with extra threat hunting, and Dome, which is a consumer product. In all of these cases, all of these particular endpoint engines have something called our contextual engine, which has a lot of rules to catch nasty stuff happening on your endpoint, like malicious command.exes. Command.exe is good. We're not going to block that. But if we see it doing some of the actions that we've seen in the past, we do catch that. I'll show you a screenshot in a moment. Same with PowerShell. Even if we didn't notice the first part of the command being bad, that PowerShell did a lot of malicious things too. Our contextual engine catches that. On top of that, do know that you can configure our AD360 and EPDR and Cytomic in 3 different modes. One's called audit mode, one is called hardened mode, and one is called lock mode. Lock mode is the most secure, could add a little friction to users. Essentially, in audit mode, you get our contextual engine protections. So you still have that, and you get signature detection, cloud lookups, and things like that. What you don't get is files and processes on your computer can basically be three things. They can be known goodware, they can be unknown, or they can be badware. Those are the only 3 choices with our systems. If they're known goodware, we run them. If they're badware, we obviously block them. If they're unknown, that is the question. In audit mode, we still check those unknown files, but you allow your users to run them. Your users can run that unknown file even while we're checking it. Now, in hardened mode, if that unknown file came from a network or the internet, you're not going to be allowed to run it until we check it. So that's good protection. It may take a while. We have an SLA for our attestation service, which not only goes through a lot of automated checking, but even has human analysts watching these files with the SLA. So if you're running in audit mode, files from the network might be delayed a little for that, but the good news is they're not going to run at all. And in lock mode, no matter where the file comes from, if it's unknown, we're not going to run it until WatchGuard or Panda Research Labs says for sure if it's good or bad. And we make this decision for every single file within a very specific period of time using both automated techniques and a group of real-time researchers. So really all that's to say, if you can run in lock mode, you should. The only downside is sometimes users might have to wait a bit to run some files, but it doesn't happen very often. Now, the reason I bring this all up is in lock mode, we actually prevented a lot of the other things from happening too. We talked about cert.exe and certutil.exe. Those files showed up as unknown because of their hashes. So in lock mode, they wouldn't have even been able to do what they needed to do to get that agent.exe to drop. And then finally, by the way, this is not important a few days later, but we do have signatures for all these files now. So now we can catch them without all our fancy rules, but no, our fancy rules caught them before we had the signature, which is good. To quickly show examples of this is again from the same interface. We have threat hunters that some of our customers use to check things. So we have global intelligence seeing this happen real time, but this is the same interface you could use to monitor your own endpoints. And you can see this is a case of where we can see command.exe being run, which is goodware, that's why it's green, but we immediately can tell it's doing bad stuff. If you notice, this is the Windows command you saw before. So this is the contextual engine rule that actually would prevent the command.exe from doing some of the bad stuff. And this one, a little further, is the same thing, but it's triggering on the PowerShell part of that command.exe. So if you remember, The second thing command.exe did was spawn PowerShell, which immediately did some bad stuff, including dropping this bad cert.exe file. We detected that as well. So long story short, if you had WatchGuard 8360 or the other products I mentioned on your endpoints, we would have prevented this ransomware from actually getting on it. So Marc, why don't you, I guess I covered this a little bit early, but I guess you can finish up covering it in more detail.
Yeah, like Corey mentioned, if you're using EPDR, EPP, or 8360, you've got the different options for lock, hardened, or audit mode. And again, like if you were in lock mode, it would have prevented this attack and many of the associated files just straight up because they were unknown until they were classified as malicious. And again, that classification can be like almost instantaneously through machine learning and AI models. But if we don't have a strong enough certainty after running through the automated tools, it does go to an actual human being who then goes and reverse engineers it in order to determine whether it is good or bad and blocks it. So again, many different opportunities to have caught this threat. It did a pretty dang good job of catching it in this scenario, even without those signatures right off the bat too, using those fancy rules, which I think now should be our marketing speak for
fancy rules. Yeah.
Fancy rules.
I don't think marketing will change the contextual engine for us.
Fancy rules. All right, awesome.
So yeah, I might speed up a little bit now just to try to get into the defense, just to try to get the questions quicker. But now let's talk about defense tips, and we're kind of going to cover two sides of them. One, very incident specific, what you should be doing now if this affects you, especially for that 15% that uses Kaseya, but then also some general ones as well.
So when it comes to the incident-specific defensive tips, we've already given quite a few of them. First off, if you haven't already, disable your VSA server until it's patched. Kaseya did a great job of reaching out to just about every single one of their partners and customers to tell them to disable these servers, which, I mean, if you give them crap for the amount of time it potentially took to resolve some vulnerabilities, you do have to give them props for how quickly they acted on this event as it was unfolding. Very impressive on that part. Again, they've posted updates to their blog with a run book for both SAS, their SaaS, and their on-premises solutions as well. Basically, once these patches are available and the services are back up, this is your step-by-step how you need to bring your server back on securely.
Well, actually, it's a run book you should be doing before you patch, because it's going to guide you through some things that should, there's some changes to your IIS settings. There's some FireEye stuff that you can pre-set up. So you should be going through these run books now, because they will prepare you for the patch, which does have some changes. So check out the run books right now.
Yep, but also be on the lookout for that patch. Current ETA is July 8th, and they do say they've got high confidence of hitting that, but, you know, things happen, it could slip.
I would add they have high confidence for sure of the Sunday SaaS update. The July, honestly, they had said yesterday the patch would be out by 5 p.m. Eastern yesterday. So now that they say the patch is coming, we do still suspect it is coming before the SaaS update, and I think today could be the day, but I would continue to watch their blog, because, you know, I'm not throwing shade at Kaseya, but yesterday the times changed a few times throughout the day. This is certainly a complex situation for them, so I'm not really blaming them for it, but keep on the lookout.
In the meantime, though, there's still other things you can do, like deploying a least privilege principle to remote management interfaces. So again, only allowing access to those who specifically need it instead of exposing it widely to the internet. This is where we'll get into a little bit later, where zero trust architecture really comes in as well, of basically ensuring that access is limited strictly to those who need it. And then a web application firewall in front of the applications, or even something as simple as just inspecting HTTPS traffic to and from these applications, can go a long way to protecting you from malware getting dropped or potentially other exploits as well.
WatchGuard doesn't have WAF, but do know WAF it's very different from a normal firewall. There's different levels of it, like there's a mostly negative or positive model WAF, like mod security, which mostly checks for known kind of attacks, but then there's negative model ones, which they basically learn your website and only allow interactions and parameters to be entered into URLs that are known to be ones on your website. So WAFs are usually intended for your own website, but the thing is, every web management interface you have is basically a web application. And we suspect many of these flaws are going to be, we know they're happening through gets and posts. The arbitrary file upload one is probably very much a web application flaw. The way they're stealing the credentials probably involves the web application. So a WAF is something that would be great not only in front of your own website / web application, but to use in front of any web application management interface you have in your network if you expose it publicly. But going to Marc's advice above, we know you have to remotely manage, but there's ways to do it without exposing remote management completely publicly. For general tips, I'm going to speed through it, but the questions you really need to ask yourself, whether or not you have Kaseya or not, is, do you have, and by the way, we had polling questions, I'm skipping them for time. Do you have a business continuity disaster recovery plan in place? Do you have one? A lot of people don't, because it's kind of hard. You know, we're all busy. We have fires in our normal business to attend to. It's hard to think about planning for events we're not sure when will happen. But the truth is, it's not a matter of if, but when. These disasters, whether they're cyber or not, do happen. Having this plan in place, having it updated regularly and testing it is good. On top of that, when it is a cyber incident like this, whether you're a customer affected by ransomware or whether you're an MSP who's not only directly affected yourself but has your own customers, this is a cyber attack. Do you have legal counsel on retainer? Because the first person you should be going to is legal counsel, because this is now a security investigation. You're going to want to collect evidence and have a chain of evidence, and legal counsel can help you with that. Do you have incident response, security incident response on staff? If you don't have either of those things, you really, which many small companies don't, you know, a small company may not be big enough to have it directly. There are, you know, companies out there that can have it as a service where you can have them on retainer to help you when this type of stuff happens. That all should be part of your business continuity disaster recovery plan. So make sure to have it. You know, backup's obvious. You don't have to be told that. But the testing, the restoring, and the table, you know, doing tabletops where you actually have to recover to see if it works, doing that as part of your BCDR plan is very important. The other thing about backup, I'm going to let, I think Marc has a good uncoupling story, but you notice we say on this slide 322 backup. There's different levels of backup, and 322 is what many recommend for ransomware. 3 is the amount of media, you know, the amount of media types you have backup. 2 is the type of online, offline methods, and the second 2 is how many different places you have those different backups. So it's all about having multiple copies of backup using different methods, because in some cases, for instance, in past MSP ransomware attacks, the bad guys knew that, for instance, MSPs used Veeam. So they targeted the Veeam backup and deleted that before actually installing the ransomware. But if you follow 322 backup, you will have backup of your backup, which can help you. And finally, I already mentioned tabletop exercises, but Marc, why don't you talk a little bit about uncoupling backup?
Yeah, so like in the grand scheme of things, even though they exploited a bunch of zero-day vulnerabilities in this attack, it was a relatively unsophisticated ransomware attack when it came to deploying it. Like they didn't go through many of the steps that a lot of modern threat actors do of scoping out the network, figuring out where your backups are, and disabling or deleting them before they actually hit it, which is interesting because that is really par for the course for what they do these days. And so if your backup solution is a part of your remote management solution, you make it really easy for them to just go in there and delete it and disable it. Even if it's still coupled to your domain, you still have issues with them being able to hop on and then using their access, going and deleting it. I mean, as part of my jobs, and I guess Corey's as well, is we travel around to conferences to go speak at events and meet with partners. And the number of times that I've heard stories from people saying, yeah, you know, we had great backups, we were doing them daily. We would have been fine to restore. In fact, we were testing restoration, but it turns out that, you know, when it came time to do it, they had gone in and deleted them several weeks prior. And so even though we were able to restore, we're quite a bit behind because we weren't monitoring that quickly. And this is where really it takes a little extra work in this case to set up a backup solution completely separately managed from the rest of your IT infrastructure. But that extra work that you take is also extra work the threat actors have to do in order to get after that backup solution then too.
And 322 could help there in the multiple methods of backup. For instance, it might be okay to have one of the backup methods connected to your RMM, even though, as Marc points out, that does make it easy for them to delete when you're using 322, because you will then have another method that's disconnected. So there are other non-critical incidents where you may be using backup, where it might be convenient to have it as part of your RMM system. So maybe you still have that one for those non-ransomware cases. But with 322, there's always another method besides that one in case the attackers did actually delete that one. The next one, again, Marc, why don't you cover this one?
Yeah, so again, just general tips for cyber attacks and ransomware in general. Like most of these advanced threats have multiple vectors of attack. They could come in through 0 days, they could come in through phishing, they could come in through account takeover or authentication attacks. Basically, there's many different ways for a cyber incident to start, which is why you need a layered defense. Like there's no single thing that you can set up and deploy or turn on or buy that's going to protect you from every single cyber attack. Nothing is 100% effective unless it's unplugging your computers and turning off the power, basically. And so that means that you need to make sure you have multiple layers to catch the threats that one or more layers miss. And so that really boils down to a combination of both network and endpoint security, as well as training for your users as well. Like phishing awareness probably wouldn't have saved you in this incident, but it will save you in future incidents. Things like multi-factor authentication, and that means secure versions of MFA. Not using text-based unless it's your only option, but instead using the secure push notification-based MFA. Advanced and proactive anti-malware engines that don't just rely on signatures, but instead have fancy rules or behavioral detection in order to catch these threats as they are unfolding, even if they are brand new. And then again, endpoint detection response to help catch the highly evasive threats that are doing things like living off the land attacks and abusing your system's built-in tools in order to execute, sometimes without even touching storage or your hard drive on your systems at all.
Yeah, and the final tip Marc alluded to before is you really want to start adopting a zero trust paradigm. There's products that can help now, products that are making this easier. But zero trust, you know, the classic defense paradigm seemed to be kind of like a Tootsie Pop. It had a hard and crunchy exterior, but once you got inside, it was soft and chewy. And the truth is, we can no longer trust our internal networks too. We have to consider everything untrusted until we verify, or as we say below, you know, verify before that trust. And zero trust is all about making sure that you've identified every user and device, that, you know, everything, every policy, whether it's firewall policies, remote access policies, endpoint policies, whatever policies there are, it starts with a user that has some sort of validation. By the way, that does put extra pressure on how you digitally validate the user. So we also tie this strongly to MFA. You know, as we know, credentials can be stolen, and if someone steals your credential to become that user, so make sure to leverage stronger authentication methods that use multi-factor for sure. But once you've identified users, you know, even on your local network, should an accountant have access to a source code server? No, they don't use it at all for their job. And yet on many flat networks inside businesses, there might be a login to that server, but on a network level, the accountant can ping and get to that server because it's just part of the local LAN. In a zero trust situation, you would maybe segment by users and you would limit access. You would not allow the network connection from the accountant to the server. And that's true on the internet too. I mean, the easiest way to talk about zero trust is with the remote management interface itself. Now, I know remote management is kind of complex and it's different for every system, whether it's Kaseya, Autotask, ConnectWise, whoever. Some of them do need ports open, especially to the agents and the clients they talk to. But the actual connection to get to the management system, the web-based management, that is something you can and should control. We actually highly suggest that you VPN. You don't expose that to the internet. You put something like VPN on top of it. If you do have to expose it to the interface, you should try to put some sort of access control list around it. And I know that people move around a lot, technicians move around a lot, so maybe you can use Dyn DNS. That's why, by the way, we think VPN's the best choice. I also know there's complexity that adds more work to the MSP, right? You're often VPNing directly into the client while you're managing them too. So maybe you don't like 2 VPNs at the same time. But even though it's more work, we really heavily recommend that you really lock down the management interface. Even though it has its own login, it has its own MFA, if it has vulnerabilities and you expose it to the internet, and all software will eventually have them, you know, you're going to get hit. So try to limit that access using zero trust paradigms. And finally, I want to leave us time for questions, so I'm not going to spend much time on that. The truth is there is no silver bullet to security. We have lots of technologies that can help. Other people have lots of technologies that can help. As you saw, some of our endpoint products were really good at preventing the ransomware from hitting clients, but they actually did not stop the core exploits, the zero-day exploits against the Kaseya server itself. So it's really not a matter of one or the other defenses, it's layering them all together. And more important, even when you have the technology, is it's much a human problem about the right policy. And that all has to do with you. You can have a firewall, but if you're not applying zero trust principles yourself, which is harder policy to apply, it takes more time and work to strategize and think about this, you know, that ends up being your weak link. So realize that there's never going to be a single solution. But if you combine the technologies that exist today with a lot of the right policy that you guys can add yourself, you really can protect yourself. So that's all we have for slides. I hope this was very useful. That said, we'd love to open up to questions. I don't see any yet, but if anyone has any questions, we're happy to stay for 3 minutes, maybe even 5 over if the presentation platform allows, and answer any questions you have.
There was one that came in with the email registration, I remember, where someone asked, is it possible for this attack to have occurred without any user interaction, and if the server was fully patched both on a software and hardware level? And Corey, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, and I kind of alluded to that before. The answer is yes, this was possible to attack. Again, we're still learning tiny details, so I guess it might depend a little bit on that credential leak. But as far as we can tell, these chained vulnerabilities didn't require an administrator to do anything except for expose their management interface. So the chained vulnerabilities allows an attacker to get in without any user interaction by you other than exposing the management service. And then once they have that access, it was all automated to send that command to the clients and run them. So, and some of the vulnerabilities the IVD found were patched, but there's obviously ones that are not in a fully patched version of the cloud or on-premise version. So even if you had the latest up-to-date patches, while maybe one of the patches could have fixed some other DIVD flaws, it did not fix these ones.
And that's pretty common. Like, even while there may be some interaction with like a phishing email that gets you to give up your credentials, once they get a hold of those credentials, or a vulnerability in this case, that they don't need you at all anymore. As long as they can access the system on a network level, they can often leverage that to then carry out whatever they're attempting to do.
Yep. So excellent question. I'm waiting a little longer. I don't see, oh, here we go. I see a question. Let me pop it. Just a sec. Are you able to get that question up, Marc?
Yeah, so this first one I saw pop up was, are there any extra protection methods we can use for Panda Systems Manager apart from multi-factor authentication? And I'd say the answer to this boils down to, again, that zero trust approach. So ensuring that any local access you have is restricted, but then for these cloud-based SaaS applications, again, MFA is a very strong protection in that. Yeah. Obviously, phishing awareness goes a long way too to protect against giving up credentials, but go ahead, Corey.
I was going to say, by the way, notice Kaseya SaaS wasn't affected. They might have internally had some of the flaws that were technically affected there, but the one good thing about using the SaaS version, you know, Aether, Orion, many of our web-based, SaaS-based management products for these tools, we have our own, you know, OPSEC. We have a team that is monitoring them. They have microservices. So a lot of the time, you know, vendors aren't perfect either. A SaaS service can suffer from a vulnerability, but we are monitoring that very, very diligently all the time for uptime, for things that are happening. So I actually think the cool thing about the SaaS service is you should enable MFA. That's the best thing you can do, but you're kind of putting the security of it in our hands, which is, you know, this is a trust game. You have to pick and choose who you trust based on their actions before, but we are doing a lot to monitor the SaaS service. And I would suggest the reason the SaaS service might not have been affected by Kaseya is because of that real-time monitoring. It's kind of like WordPress hosted versus WordPress server. You know, when there's tons and tons of WordPress vulnerabilities all the time, but WordPress hosted never gets hit because a cloud service, the vendor can patch it almost immediately right when they know something's wrong, but it's up to everyone else to take care of the servers they maintain. So I do think for SaaS versions of a cloud, MFA is your best option.
Yep. Another question that came in is, do other RMM providers have similar exploits with their applications? And Corey hinted on this earlier. It's that, yes, this one happened to be Kaseya, but it could just as easily be someone else next time. Like, no application is immune from vulnerabilities or attack we've seen in the past. I mean, heck, SolarWinds was just a few months ago too. It could literally happen to anyone. It just so happened to Kaseya this time.
I will even point out some of the past MSP attacks affected ConnectWise systems, but happened to be a Kaseya plugin. Not to throw shade at any of them. To be very frank, WatchGuard can have and has had vulnerabilities in our product. What you should do is when you're, it's not a matter of if a software product has vulnerabilities. Microsoft, Apple, every software vendor has. It's one, how they react to them, how quickly and transparently they are about them, how quickly they fix them. And two, you want to learn about their security practice. How do they do secure software development? Do they use bug bounties, private or public? For instance, we don't have a public bug bounty program yet, but we've been doing a lot of private bug bounty testing against our products, and we plan on going public one day. So we have third-party auditors check, for these vulnerabilities. We find a bunch and we fix them. We just did a cool challenge that we'll be talking about one day on Secplicity, where we found some. The good news, by the way, none high, none are these pre-authenticated remote root types. They're all kind of mediums. But we do that kind of checking to audit our software regularly. And that's something, every vendor is going to have vulnerabilities. But as you pick your vendors, you really want to learn what they do about security. And even in how they answer, how transparent they are, that'll give you an idea of how much they focus on it, in my opinion.
Yep. Another question, can you mention again the Reddit communities you recommend to follow? It was r/MSP and r/sysadmin are the two really good ones for this style of community. I'd go so far as to say r/netsec is another good one, where you tend to see a lot of technical analysis of these styles of attacks and other hacking related events pop up through there as well.
And if you don't remember the R, if you put Reddit and just put R, that's how to get directly there. But if you search for MSP, sysadmin and NetSec just in Reddit, you'll find all of these pages. I will say all the vendors have them. Kaseya has their own Reddit sub as well, where they've been posting. We have one, etc.
Another one I see here is, if you had to whitelist the Kaseya working directory with your antivirus product, would it have prevented this attack, or would you have been open to this attack? And unfortunately, that is one of the issues with these whitelists that a lot of vendors ask for, is that it does tend to prevent your software from monitoring that specific directory. That said, that is monitoring that directory and not the rest of the processes running on the system. Like, it would still monitor command prompt launching the rest of the command string in this case. So would it protect you there?
So the processes will still get detected. And also notice if you're in locker harden mode, some of the other files were dropped in Windows and what was the other one? I think it was a System 32 or I forget it. But there were a couple files dropped in more Windows-related directories than Kaseya ones. But that's the good thing about EDR and more advanced endpoint protection products is we're not just looking for files and scanning them. We're paying attention to processes. We're paying attention to memory injection technique. We're paying attention to a lot of things. So I do think excluding that directory would have caused us not to get all of the indicators we saw, but it would have still probably caught all the contextual engine stuff.
I will say this is one thing the industry as a whole needs to do better on, and something you should push your software vendors to work towards as well. Like the days of exclusions should be behind us. It's something I know this is probably an ivory tower thing that I'm saying.
But land attacks, right, where these files are often in very operating system oriented directories anyways.
Exactly. Like, I would like to see software vendors, especially RMM, and I get it, like there's a lot of stuff that looks like malicious actions that occur with these management platforms that does tend to cause problems with some anti-malware protections. But it's something that you can still at least test and account for and work towards fixing instead of just these blanket whitelists that leave an entire blind spot on your system. Let's see, Alicia, do we have time to answer a couple more, or are we gonna need to follow the rest up with email?
I mean, we can spend more time because I see that a lot of people is still here. We have so many questions, so just feel free to decide if you can stay a little bit longer.
I'm happy to stay a bit. Yeah.
Sure. I'll pitch another couple more to you then, Corey.
One thing, because people is keeping constantly asking, we are recording this webinar, and in the next day we will share this on demand version with you. So don't worry about that you will have it so you can share it with your team.
Yep. So another one, we use ConnectWise. Did ConnectWise get hit with this ransomware? Again, this particular incident was isolated to Kaseya. That doesn't mean that ConnectWise is immune from this style of attack in the future, though. That said, we don't have any evidence to say it's vulnerable to this, but just when you, on the grand scheme of things, it's possible.
These 0-day vulnerabilities that we're still waiting for full details are going to be specifically against Kaseya VSA. I will say, you might have heard me mention, in 2019, there were a number of targeted MSP attacks that delivered ransomware too. This, by the way, this new one seems to be the largest. But one of those did involve ConnectWise's RMM, but I believe it was through a Kaseya plugin. So it affected ConnectWise if you used a particular plugin. There have been vulnerabilities against ConnectWise, like there have been all software, including our own. So I wouldn't focus too much on one RMM or the other. It's more, as Marc says, the class of attack. You got to realize that, you know, you probably have a lot of things, the security tools that can protect against ransomware and stuff. But 0-day network exploits are the one thing that IPS, you know, if it's 0-day, IPS doesn't always, traditional IPS doesn't do a good job of. And even something called network detection and response, which is kind of network-based anomaly detection, it can sometimes catch 0-day, but not always. So a 0-day vulnerability can be found in any product at any time. And that's why you really need to think about what you expose externally and how. Your web server, you have to, right? If it's a web server for the public, you have to expose that publicly. But if it's a ConnectWise web interface for you to manage your clients, are you exposing it publicly just to make it easier for you as you move all around the world? I understand that, by the way. Managing hundreds of customers while you may be on vacation in another place is hard, but you really should consider putting more limits on who gets to really important interfaces like any sort of web management interface in any RMM or PSA platform. That does take more work. I mean, there's no qualms about it. You know, you'd have to set up a VPN. I think VPNs are pretty easy to set up, but that does mean you have to consider the other VPNs you use, or you have to really define access control lists, and that can be hard because IPs can be dynamic. So unless there's dynamic DNS support, it can be difficult, but it's really worth it. So whether it's ConnectWise, Autotask, whatever you use, some of them have to have remote access in order to do their remote management job, but consider the management interface. Consider how you lock that down. You don't want anyone from the internet to ping it, even if it has its own authentication mechanisms, because they may have issues.
And that kind of flows into another question here, which was, could it be a good idea to put VSA behind the WatchGuard access portal? So for those that aren't WatchGuard customers, access portals are named for our clientless VPN, where you don't even need a VPN software installed on your computer anymore. It's all web-based through just HTTP, or I guess HTTPS access, where you can then securely provide multi-factor authentication to, again, restrict access to it, and then single sign-on to then hit your VSA server. You can do clientless RDP tunnels to manage systems locally on your network as well.
Any other web applications you shouldn't expose publicly that you should, so a great solution for that too.
Yeah, and again, that's ours. That's pretty much like most vendors these days have something similar in that case, and it's absolutely something you should be using if you have access to it.
Great suggestion, whoever posted that question/comment.
Yep. Another one, what kind of access would you need to run the commands, i.e. power user, local admin, etc.? So I'm assuming that
it was
means in
full
regards to
system.
this.
It was full system, but the Kaseya VSA agent has it. So you did need system. By system, I mean the core local admin user on Windows. But my understanding is the part of why they launched it through the VSA agent is because it had the privilege it needed to do everything it did.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. And there are a ton of questions in here now. Where's another? Oh, so as IOCs become available during an incident like this, how fast do they get added to endpoint detection response and firewall services? Is there a way for us to check if an IP or file hash is blocked? I will say most of our services, they get added automatically. We have automated tools and periodic updates to the ones that are on the appliance itself running. With some of the services like APT blocker, where each individual threat gets a cloud lookup, it's basically instantaneous. As soon as APT blocker, for example, has seen and made a determination on a threat, anytime a Firebox sends a request for that particular hash, it can instantly respond back and say, yep, that's bad, and block it right then and there. That's much more proactive than some of the other services, like the signature-based ones that do rely on signature updates that tend to occur daily, potentially multiple times a day as well, but not as proactive as that.
And to be clear, by the way, we like IOCs and we use them and store them for quick lookup after, but honestly, they're the last line of defense. The truth is, it's the things like the contextual engine, the machine learning models that we have running, the behavioral analysis models. We don't expect IOC to catch today's malware. Even the same threat, even a copy of WannaCry can be repackaged and look different, even though it does the exact same thing endless times. Millions of variants of it could be made. So yeah, as Marc says, we immediately, as soon as a machine learning engine decides something's bad or the behavioral engine knows it's bad, we take all the intelligence, all the dropped files, all the other things that we've identified with that, and it becomes an IOC so that we don't have to do as much work next time to find it. But I would, while IOCs are good, we focus on the proactive detection today, because if it's just an IOC protecting you, the zero-day aspect of malware, not exploits in this case, is just going to get past it. Yep. To frankly answer the other question, is there a place you can look up yet? No. We do have an internal place. We've created places where we can do lookups, and we even have a neat engine that some of our TDR folks made that will use all of our network security tools, but we have not made them public yet. I have talked, these are internal tools. They haven't been made for prime time yet, but we have talked about offering that kind of thing, so maybe in the future. But right now, it takes, we can definitely answer that question for you if you have it. Talk to your sales SEs, for instance, and they will come to us, but we don't have a public tool. I will say VirusTotal is a neat shortcut because it does have some of our engines. Obviously, Panda is in there. Bitdefender is a tool. Is the gateway antivirus we use for the Firebox. It doesn't show our APT blocker results, though. Our APT blocker results will catch things immediately.
It does if you've got a premium license, which I'm guessing most folks don't, but the last line analysis is available for some licensing with VirusTotal. Actually quite a few questions in here regarding TDR and its availability or ability to catch this. If you've got TDR configured with sandbox analysis by APT blocker set up, it's basically the same thing as the Firebox, but without that whole proxy requirement, meaning that it would have detected and blocked this immediately. And again, because it first does a hash lookup, it would have been able to do a real quick answer on that instead of having to wait for the file analysis. So yes, TDR.
With the APT blocker, definitely. There is a chance that HRP catches it. I will have to say HRP stands for host ransomware prevention. And it is actually something that happens on your endpoint where we're doing every process that runs, we do immediate behavioral analysis of what that process is doing. I have not checked this hash against host ransomware protection yet. But since we know APT blocker blocks it, and that is part of TDR, you will be good to go there.
A couple questions about clarification on when I mentioned text-based MFA isn't great. So I want to preface this with any multi-factor authentication is better than no multi-factor authentication. If you're relying just on a username and password, that's not enough. And if you have the ability to add any additional factor, that's great. That said,
so if text is your only option, use it.
yep, not all multi-factor authentication is created equal when it comes to security. You can just ask or maybe we've talked about Reddit a lot, but the Reddit administrators about that, where a few years ago, someone managed to first get a hold of their usernames and passwords for a bunch of the developers. And then that same threat actor called up the mobile phone provider for those Reddit developers and convinced them to port the number over to a SIM card under their control, which then let them intercept the SMS messages and then log in. So text-based MFA has issues with that, with potential malicious apps on phones.
Signaling System 7, which is a telco standard. It should be something only telcos have access to, but there's been a lot of leaks that allowed public access to it. And basically, since SMS texts are clear text among telcos, if you can get into a service that has access to Signal SS7, you can start to see and track text from one phone to another real time too. So long story short is NIST now says SMS-based, text-based two-factor is not strong enough because there's many different ways you can intercept a text message.
And it sounds sophisticated, but like at the end of the day, it's not actually that difficult to call up T-Mobile or AT&T and convince that 18-year-old on the other end of the line to port over a phone number to something else. Yeah. Like simple social engineering works really well with this style of attack.
There's also been Android malware that's probably even simpler. So if I can get you to sideload something on your phone, I now see all your text too. There has been Windows ransomware that try to even look for Android phones being plugged in USB.
Exactly. Let's see. So Kaseya knew about the vulnerabilities in April, but didn't resolve some. Did they warn any customers at all that this could happen, or did they underestimate the risk? And this is one of the just issues in general with vulnerability disclosure is the first and foremost, no company is going to try and be just malicious off the bat. They're trying to protect their customers, and that means not releasing the details or even potentially the knowledge of a vulnerability until it's been patched. Because oftentimes if you say there's an authentication bypass vulnerability in our product before you patch it, it just means every single threat actor is going to go try and find it. And then they will exploit it and hit your customers.
I would say an easy answer is I would go read the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure, DID's post. They're the ones that reported him. And they actually claim that Kaseya has been great in their reaction. They release a lot of vulnerabilities to a lot of vendors. And by the way, we've seen vendors react to ones Marc's found and vice versa, how we react. And while it seems like it's been a long time, there were 7 critical vulnerabilities, and DIVD says they're handling them properly. And by the way, of the 7, only 3 remain unpatched. They have patched 4. Now, I don't know, but it's very typical for a vendor not to share details until after the patch. If you follow what's called coordinated vulnerability disclosure, or what I call responsible vulnerability full disclosure, it's all about protecting you, the customers. And it's like Marc says, it's not any sort of trying to hide from you. It's making sure the bad guys don't get the details until we have solid protections for people out there. So it feels like a long time, but I don't think it is. And I think the people that know best are the ones that reported. And if you check out DIVD's post, they actually say that Kaseya is doing a good job.
Yep. Another question, how would geolocation enabled have affected this attack? Unfortunately for this one, it looks like that would not have really done anything because if you remember from the IOCs, they all came from cloud hosting services that are based in like the United States. And in general, people that enable geolocation to block attack or block connections from certain locations aren't going to be blocking the United States because that would cause quite a bit of issues. And that's basically what threat actors these days do. Like, yes, technically, if they're based in Russia, they could connect straight from Russia to your servers. But in general, they're going to go through proxies. They're going to abuse cloud-based services and come from there. They're going to attack other systems based in your locale and then use those to then hit your system. Like, it works. It does a good job of catching some things. But at the end of the day, like if a even relatively sophisticated attacker wants to get in, they're going to find a way past geolocation-based services.
I would be even stronger. I know we have a feature for this ourselves, but we have geolocation because people demand it and ask for it. But I actually think it's worthless. People ask all the time, should I block Russia or China? I think it's pointless. Any smart hacker knows how to proxy. Any smart hacker knows how to VPN. Instead, in fact, most Trojans, one of the first things they have is a SOX proxy. So and it's in their own, benefit to hide where they're coming from, just not to get caught, let alone if you're geo-blocking them. So I personally don't think having big geo-blocks is going to protect you from a lot of vulnerabilities. Everyone asks for the capability, and it's also interesting to see where things are coming from. But I actually don't think it's a very strong security protection.
A question in here for, do you think something like the Windows print spooler remote code execution vulnerability, so talking about print nightmare, could that have had the same type of hit? I'd say no, and that the reason this was so damaging and effective is because they came through management software that had access to these thousands of customers and thousands of endpoints, basically. Whereas something like that would have required existing network access. Obviously, it makes a bad attack worse in that case. But this was basically like having the keys to the front door to come in and put whatever you wanted inside the house.
So that one part of it Mark mentioned is you're literally getting the thing that has access to all the client's computers, not just your own. But the other thing is how often is it publicly accessible on the internet? You don't often put your print spooler on the internet, right? Some people do sometimes, but it's not usually internet exposed. Even though me and I think Mark would argue that these web-based management interfaces should be protected and not exposed, it is actually pretty typical for these RMMs to have their web interfaces on the internet. So I think, what Mark said, one, it's a high value target because it hits all the systems, not just the printer as a way to do lateral movement or the printer spool service on one server. But also because it happens to be a service that people expose remotely quite often.
Yep.
By the way, just if you're curious about Print Nightmare, we do have an analyst writing about that too. It's been happening for a month. We do have an IPS signature for the remote part of that exploit. Microsoft just released another update for that patch yesterday. As you might know, I think they have fixed the remote part pretty well, but there's a local privilege escalation involved as well, which they have been having trouble fixing properly.
Couple questions here on, they said your explanation for 322 went a little too quickly. Could you elaborate on that real quick, or maybe a little less quick?
Sure. So 322 is a backup method, and what each of those numbers,
we lost
or each
your
of
presentation
those,
slide, by the way, Corey.
Oh,
Still trying to keep that up. As beautiful as your desktop background is. There we go. And now you're muted, which I think is for the better. Still muted.
I'm pressing the wrong buttons here. So I dropped the presentation for a second, but 322 is a great backup method. 322, each of those numbers stands for something, and there can be 321, there can be 311. But the first number is how many copies of your data do you have? So 322 means you should have 3 copies of data. That means it exists in 3 different places, 3 copies. Hopefully in a second they're in different places too, but you need 3 copies of it. The second number represents how many different media types or places you store these copies. So it could be different devices. You could have 2 backup copies locally, but on 2 different devices. It could be 2 backup copies in different places. And the final one is how many copies you keep off-site. The off-site one's kind of important. That I'd also consider that you don't have connected to your RMM, for instance. So again, the first number, how many copies of data. The second number is how many different types of copies, different devices, different backup mechanisms. And the final number is how many copies, you can have one in a remote location and one in the cloud, for instance, to have 2 off-site copies. So 322 is a very strong way because you have a lot of copies. You actually have different types of backups, and you're leaving them in 2 different off-site places, maybe one in the cloud, and I don't think anyone stores tapes anymore, but one could be tapes offline somewhere. So that's what those numbers represent. And if you look up 322, 321, you know, it's different levels of how many copies you have, but the point really comes down to you need offline and online copies, you want offsite and on-site copies, and you probably want more than one backup mechanism just to cover your bases. Doesn't have to be complex. Not all of them need to be products. You know, some you can use freeware too, but that is what 322 or 321, etc. means. So just give it a Google search, and I think you'll find a lot of information. A lot of ransomware folks have really been pushing for 322 just because the bad guys have been so good at, you know, doing enough pre-work, enough reconnaissance to actually delete anything that they can find before they actually encrypt you. I hope that makes sense.
Yep, that sounds great. A couple more popped up asking, was Pulseway and or other vendors involved? Again, to reiterate, this was isolated in this specific instance to Kaseya VSA. That said, it is a style of attack that could happen to anyone. So you still need to make sure that regardless of the RMM you're using, you're still following the best practices and using zero trust architecture and least privilege access.
Is it Pulseway or Pulse Secure, out of curiosity, Mark?
Pulseway RMM software.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one. I thought someone might have been referencing to the Pulse Secure kind of remote access vulnerabilities that have happened in the past. But in either case, whether it's RMM software or those old vulnerabilities, they were not involved in this particular attack at all.
Yep. Let's see. I think we've gotten through most of them. There's one philosophical question here that I think might be appropriate for us to answer to round it out. These attacks have been global. Should there not be a government solution for this type of criminal activity? For example, in the failure of Exchange servers and Microsoft, are the NSA and FBI mitigations that partially resolve the same issues? The legal issue is dubious, but should telecommunication providers have a responsibility in the traffic that they allow to pass? And man, that's a tough one, because there's a lot of protections, basically like safe harbor laws for telecommunications providers, where by nature they are not responsible for monitoring and their traffic that they pass through them. Because if they're suddenly held liable, then they become the arbiters of what's allowed to go past their networks, and it could lead to issues with censorship. It could lead to issues with paid access to certain things you're trying to go to.
That cause
false
issues.
positives, yes. And so, yes, it would be nice to be able to say this is their fault and they should try and fix something like this. But it boils down to, we need to do the best job with the tools that we have to ensure that we're defending our own systems against threats without relying on other people.
Yeah, so I agree completely on telcos. Now, the government part, this ransomware has become $1 trillion global issue that's affecting many businesses, not just monetarily, but in uptime, and has caused danger to lives when it affects healthcare, global pipelines. This absolutely should and is right now a topic for governments. You know, you might know our current president, love him or hate him, Biden, has been creating some rules and sanctions that he's trying to talk to Putin about for this. I will say, traditionally, nation states, you know, you would hope they weren't directly part of criminally money-motive ransomware. There is some evidence that maybe North Korea is, because they have sanctions that, you know, maybe they have trouble making money other ways. But the one thing that seems to be happening, this is all Corey's opinion, allegedly, but the one thing that seems to be happening is we know for a fact a lot of these groups exist in Russia. That does not mean the Russia government is backing them or that they're state-sponsored, but they seem to have a turn the other cheek to approach to this. There's not the same extradition laws that we have with other kind of more friendly Five Eyes countries. And there, you know, other countries, you have seen in some cases, for instance, just recently in Ukraine, authorities from global countries have come together and arrested a big amount of ransomware actors, but then a lot of the core group was still in Russia, who seems to be you know, turning a blind eye to this. So I do think that this is a global problem. I do think the UN, NATO, and any sort of global organization needs to start creating rules around this that include sanctions and stuff like that. And I believe that is starting to happen. But unfortunately, all of that, we have no control over it. You have no control over it. And there's no guarantee that some of the adversarial countries are going to do anything about it, which is why I think Marc's response of until there's a better way, we need to be the ones to protect ourselves. We need to take our own future into our own hands and just try to follow the best practices we can, even though some of the best policies are harder to implement.
Yep, I think that's great advice. And I think we've made it through the bulk of the questions. Again, if we didn't get to yours, I believe the invite for this webinar came from Corey's email. So feel free to blow up his inbox with the additional questions you have. Otherwise, you can always find us on Twitter too and ask any cyber related questions there too. I'm XORRO_. Corey is at SecAdept. And we have no problem asking any questions, pointed or not, there too. But again, I know we went half an hour over, so thank you all for sticking around too.
One more thing.
You can hand it back to Alicia now.
One more thing before you go. When we finish the webinar, a survey is going to pop up. So please feel free to share your opinion with us. Thanks a lot for your time and have a great day. Thanks, Corey. And thanks, Marc, to you all. Bye-bye.